Elias woke to the sound of crashing waves and the biting sting of cold wind against his skin. His head throbbed, his body aching as he tried to push himself up from the wet sand. The remnants of the storm that had wrecked his ship still lingered in the air, thick clouds overhead, and the ocean roared in the distance. He had no idea where he was or how long he had been unconscious. His last memory was of the ship being torn apart by the violent storm, and the next thing he knew, he had washed up on a foreign shore. Confusion clouded his mind as he stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky, his stomach empty. He didn't even have a sense of direction, the coast stretching out before him in both directions. His only instinct was to move, to get away from the water and figure out where he was. The forest loomed at the edge of the beach, its dense trees shadowing the ground, but it was the only option. With the sound of the ocean still ringing in his ears, Elias turned toward the darkened woods and forced himself to walk. The forest seemed alive in a way he had never experienced before. Strange, eerie noises echoed through the trees, and every rustle of the leaves made him tense. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with the smell of wet earth and something else. Something wild. The further he walked, the more he felt like he was being watched. But there was no sign of movement, no figures in the shadows. It was a deep, unsettling silence that gnawed at him. He pressed on, each step more labored than the last, the uncertainty weighing heavily on him. His thoughts scattered, torn between the fear of being lost in a foreign land and the hope that someone human, might be out there, somewhere. But even as that thought crossed his mind, something inside him felt a deep, primal unease. The forest, with its unnatural stillness, seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. It was then that he heard the footsteps. The sound was soft at first, barely audible, but gradually growing louder, moving with a rhythmic, almost predatory grace. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't alone. His heart hammered in his chest as the footsteps circled him, the tension in the air thickening. The creature or creatures making the noise was nearby, but he couldn't see them. His mind raced. Were they human? He tried to listen carefully, his senses heightened. But there was no time for thinking. The soft rustling of leaves grew louder, and before he could even react, he was surrounded. The figure that emerged from the shadows was not human. Not entirely. A woman, or at least a woman's form. She stood tall, her features both beautiful and alien. Her skin the rich, sun-kissed gold of the wildlands. The eyes that stared back at him were cat-like, slanted pupils that gleamed with a strange, predatory curiosity. Her hair was dark and braided into intricate patterns, falling around her shoulders in loose waves. She was dressed in a mix of leather and fur, her muscles toned and strong beneath the clothing. She exuded an air of dominance, her movements deliberate and measured as she approached him. Elias barely had time to process what was happening before she stepped closer, her gaze locking with his. "You're human," she said, her voice low and smooth, almost a purr. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Yes, I'm lost," she interrupted, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Very lost." Elias didn't know how to respond, too stunned by the sight before him. She wasn't just any woman. There was something animalistic in the way she held herself, the confidence in her stance, the grace in her movements. She was no ordinary human, nor was she entirely beast. Her presence was commanding, as if she belonged to a world far removed from his own. Before he could make sense of his thoughts, more figures stepped from the shadows, others like her, but each with their own distinct features. Some had the sleek bodies of felines, others the powerful build of wolves or the long, sinuous tails of serpents. They watched him with eyes that burned with curiosity and something darker. The woman, Elias assumed she was their leader, stepped closer. The others remained silent, observing him from a distance. "I am Lyra," she said, her voice now taking on a more authoritative tone. "Queen of the Wildwoods, and you, human, are a rare thing in this land. How did you come here?" Elias struggled to find his words. He could feel his pulse quicken under her gaze, his body trembling as he tried to make sense of the situation. My ship was destroyed in the storm. I washed up here. Lyra tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly, studying him. A shipwreck. How unfortunate. She stepped closer still, her gaze never leaving him, and Elias instinctively took a step back, his nerves fraying. He had never felt more out of place, more exposed. "Why are you here?" she asked again, her voice softer, almost teasing, as she circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. I I don't know," he admitted, his voice betraying his uncertainty. "I was just trying to survive." A low chuckle escaped her lips. Survival. Yes, that is what we all do. But here you will need more than just survival. You'll need to adapt. Her eyes traveled over his form, lingering on his exposed skin, taking in the way his clothes clung to his body, his human features so starkly different from the creatures around him. Lyra stopped in front of him, inches from his face. The air between them crackled with tension. "What will you do, human? What are you willing to offer us?" Elias swallowed hard, trying to maintain composure, but the weight of her gaze was almost too much. His heart raced. He had never felt so vulnerable, yet so alive. "I don't have anything to offer. I just want to survive." A smile tugged at the corner of Lyra's lips, a smile that held no warmth, only amusement. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm, sending a shiver down his spine. "We will see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Survival here is not so simple as it may seem. But don't worry, human. You'll find your place soon enough." Elias didn't know if he believed her, but the way she said it, the way her touch lingered, told him that his life would never be the same again. There was something in her eyes, something dangerous and alluring, and he couldn't look away. The other beast folk around them murmured, watching with keen interest. The tension between Elias and Lyra hung in the air, thick and almost palpable. He had no idea what he had just walked into, but he knew, deep in his gut, that it would change everything. "Come," Lyra said, her voice commanding as she turned, beckoning him forward. "You will come with us." And without another word, she led him into the depths of the forest, the unknown world that awaited him. Elias followed Lyra through the dense forest, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. His feet stumbled over the uneven ground, and the strange, exotic sounds of the forest surrounded him. Unfamiliar creatures calling in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. The trees here were tall and ancient, their trunks thick and covered in moss, casting long shadows over the path. It felt like a world apart from anything he had known. Lyra moved ahead with effortless grace, her lithe form weaving between the trees as if she belonged here, as if this was her domain. She didn't glance back at him, but her presence was ever looming, like a shadow. Elias couldn't help but watch her, his eyes drawn to the way she moved, so fluid and powerful, the muscles beneath her skin rippling as she walked. Her every step was calculated, confident, as if she commanded the very forest around her. He felt small in comparison, an outsider in this strange, untamed world. The others, the beast folk who had surrounded him earlier, were close behind, walking silently through the underbrush. Some were more human-like than others, their forms a mix of animal features and humanoid proportions. There were large, muscular men and women with lupine or feline traits, their eyes glowing with a predatory intensity. Their expressions were unreadable, and they made no effort to speak to Elias, but their presence was enough to make him feel like an intruder. As they walked deeper into the forest, Elias began to notice more about their world. The trees seemed to close in, and the air grew thicker with the scent of earth and wildness. Strange, glowing plants dotted the ground, their colors shifting like an iridescent haze. The atmosphere was otherworldly, a place where the rules of his own world no longer seemed to apply. Finally, after what felt like hours, they arrived at the heart of the forest, a massive, towering structure made of wood and stone, blending seamlessly into the surrounding trees. It was a fortress, but not one built by human hands. The architecture was organic, as if the trees themselves had been shaped and bent to form walls, spires, and bridges that connected the upper levels of the towering canopy. The structure was both awe-inspiring and intimidating, a testament to the power and dominance of the beings who called this place home. Lyra led him toward the entrance, where a pair of massive armored guards stood watch. Their eyes were sharp, their bodies as imposing as the fortress itself. They parted to allow Lyra and Elias to pass, and without a word, she guided him inside. The interior was even more impressive than the outside. The walls were adorned with intricate carvings, depicting scenes of battles, hunts, and the life of the beast folk. Large, open windows allowed the light to filter in through the thick foliage, casting dappled patterns on the stone floor. It was a place of power, of ancient strength, and it was clear that Lyra ruled here. The beast folk moved about the space with quiet reverence, acknowledging her with subtle nods and glances. Lyra led Elias down a long hallway to a large, open chamber. The room was filled with cushions and low tables, but the most striking feature was the throne at the far end, made of twisted vines and dark wood. It was a throne fit for a queen, and Lyra's presence beside it seemed to fill the space with an undeniable authority. She paused for a moment, her eyes flicking over Elias as if measuring his reaction. "Sit," she commanded softly, gesturing to a cushion placed near the edge of the room. Elias hesitated but complied, settling down onto the cushion. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew better than to argue. He was a stranger here, and whatever rules governed this place, he had no choice but to follow them. Lyra, however, did not immediately take her throne. Instead, she moved to a small table in the corner, where a pitcher of dark, fragrant liquid sat. She poured the drink into 2 wooden cups, her movements deliberate, graceful. As she carried the cups over to Elias, he could feel her eyes on him, an almost palpable weight pressing against him. "Drink," she said, her voice smooth and commanding. Elias took the cup, his fingers brushing against hers as he accepted it. He had no idea what the drink was, but the aroma was sweet and intoxicating, a mix of spices and something floral. He took a cautious sip, the warmth of the liquid spreading through his chest. Lyra watched him intently, her gaze never wavering. There was something about the way she studied him that sent a shiver down his spine. He couldn't tell if it was curiosity or something more predatory, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested in some way. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. "You're weak, but there's something about you, something different." Elias blinked, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just human," he said, his voice hesitant. "I don't know what you mean." Lyra's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped closer, her movements predatory yet fluid, and Elias couldn't help but feel his heart rate quicken. There was something in the air, something that made him feel both afraid and intrigued at the same time. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "But that's fine. You'll learn. You'll adapt or you won't. It's up to you." She circled him slowly, her presence like a shadow at his back. Elias felt a strange mixture of fear and fascination, and his skin tingled where her gaze lingered. She was so close now, the scent of her perfume, earthy and wild, filling his senses. Suddenly, she stopped, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other. There was a spark in her eyes, something that seemed to pull at him. Elias could feel it, the tension, thick and undeniable. "You'll stay here at least for now," Lyra said finally, breaking the silence. "You're an anomaly, a curiosity. But more than that, I think you might have a place in this world." Elias didn't know what she meant by that, but the way she said it made him uneasy. He was still trying to process everything, trying to understand the rules of this strange place. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Lyra's eyes flicked to the door, where a few of her followers were waiting. "Take him to the holding chambers," she commanded. "Make sure he's comfortable. We'll see how he fares." With that, Elias was led away from the chamber, his mind swirling with questions he didn't have answers to. The beast folk watched him closely as he was guided through the fortress, their eyes sharp, their expressions unreadable. He had no idea what his future held in this world, but he was beginning to understand that survival would require more than just strength. It would require a different kind of strength. And Lyra was more than ready to test him. Elias was led down a narrow corridor, the walls made of thick stone and adorned with carvings of beast folk in various forms. Feline, canine, serpentine, and more, hunting, fighting, and celebrating victories. The air inside the fortress was heavy, cool, and smelled of damp earth and wood. His footsteps echoed in the silence, the only sound beside the occasional rustling of the guards who flanked him. The guards had not said a word since the chamber, their eyes watchful, but never meeting his. He tried to take in his surroundings, but it all seemed too surreal. The place was like nothing he had ever seen. Every inch of it exuded an ancient primal power. Even the flickering torches on the walls seemed to hold an aura of mystery, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. As they continued down the hallway, Elias couldn't help but think of Lyra. The way she had looked at him, that sharp, calculating gaze, had unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. She was commanding, but there was something more in her eyes, something darker and more intense, like she was studying him for a reason he couldn't fathom. He'd felt like an insect under a magnifying glass. Finally, they stopped at a large door, its wood etched with intricate symbols Elias couldn't decipher. One of the guards placed a hand on the door and pushed it open with a low creak. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the faint glow of bioluminescent plants that clung to the walls and hung from the ceiling like natural chandeliers. "This will be your room for the time being," the guard said, his voice deep and gravelly. Elias stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the large bed in the center of the room, draped with thick, plush furs. A few low tables lined the walls, their surfaces covered with strange objects that he didn't recognize. The room felt foreign and strange, like everything around him had been made for someone else, a creature who wasn't human. The guard stepped back, his eyes lingering on Elias before closing the door behind him with a soft thud. Elias was left alone in the room, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to think, but the sense of unease in his stomach only deepened. He had no idea what Lyra's intentions were or what the beast folk wanted from him. All he knew was that he was an outsider in a world that seemed both beautiful and terrifying. He moved toward the bed and sat down on the edge, the furs soft beneath him. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm himself, but his thoughts wouldn't slow down. He was alone in a strange land with no way of knowing how to survive in this new world. He was a man in a place where humans were nothing but rare curiosities. And then there was Lyra. Her presence loomed over him even now. He couldn't shake the memory of the way she had looked at him earlier, her eyes smoldering with something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. A knock at the door broke his thoughts, and Elias's heart skipped a beat. He stood quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. But when he opened the door, it was not a guard who stood before him. It was Lyra. She was dressed in simple, flowing clothes, her hair cascading down her back in soft waves. She looked even more striking up close, her golden skin glowing faintly in the low light. Her eyes met his with a sharpness that made his breath hitch in his chest, and for a moment, neither of them said a word. The air between them was charged, thick with unspoken tension. "I trust you're comfortable?" she asked, her voice smooth, almost coaxing. Elias hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I suppose. It's not what I expected." She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving him. The scent of her perfume, earthy and wild, filled the space between them, and Elias's pulse quickened. There was something magnetic about her, something that drew him in against his will. "You don't have to expect anything here," Lyra said softly. "You're not in your world anymore. Here things are different. The rules are different." Elias's throat went dry, and he took a small step back, instinctively putting more distance between them. "What do you want from me?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, but he couldn't help it. The uncertainty was overwhelming. Lyra's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. She didn't respond immediately, but instead took another step toward him. Her presence seemed to fill the room, her confidence and power radiating from her in waves. Elias could feel it, feel the strength she held in every movement, in every glance. She wasn't just any leader. She was something more, something beyond anything he had known. I want you to understand something, human, she said quietly, her tone soft but commanding. You're here because you are different. You're human, yes, but you've been brought here for a reason. You're not just some lost wanderer. Elias blinked, his mind struggling to keep up with her words. I don't understand. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be here. Lyra's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something almost tender in her eyes. No, you didn't. But here, things aren't about what we want. It's about what is meant to be. She stepped closer still, her presence now so near that Elias could feel the warmth of her body. He could see the faint shimmer of her eyes, the curve of her lips. And when she spoke again, her voice was low, almost a whisper. You'll see, Elias, she said, her fingers grazing lightly across his arm. The touch was barely there, but it was enough to send a jolt of heat through him. You will understand why you were brought here. Elias's breath hitched, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure what she meant, but there was a deep pull inside him, a desire to know more, to understand why he was here in the first place. He didn't trust her completely, but the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, made it difficult to resist. Lyra lingered for a moment longer, her gaze intense. She seemed to be studying him, almost as if trying to gauge his reaction. But before he could say anything more, she straightened and took a step back, her expression once again controlled, commanding. You'll be fine here, Elias, she said, her voice smooth, like silk. Just remember one thing, this world is ruled by strength, and you'll need more than just your wits to survive here. With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her movements graceful and fluid. Elias watched her go, his thoughts racing, his pulse still quick from the brief moment of contact. As the door closed softly behind her, Elias stood still for a long moment, his heart still pounding in his chest. The room seemed emptier without her presence, but the tension she had left in the air remained. He wasn't sure what Lyra wanted from him, or what this world held, but one thing was clear. He was going to have to fight for his place in it. And whatever Lyra's plans were, he was going to have to navigate them carefully, because in this world, weakness would not be tolerated. Elias spent the next few days in the holding chamber, his routine mostly consisting of silence and solitude. The guards came and went, delivering food and water, but never speaking a word to him. His only contact with the outside world was through the occasional brief encounter with Lyra, though she never stayed long. Each time she visited, her presence was overwhelming, her gaze steady and intense. It was as though she was studying him, evaluating him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. During those fleeting moments, Elias tried to make sense of his situation. He was trapped in an unfamiliar world, surrounded by beings far stronger and more powerful than he could ever be. His humanity, once something that set him apart, felt like a weakness here, a thing to be scrutinized and tested. Lyra's cryptic words from their last meeting replayed in his mind constantly. This world is ruled by strength, she had said. But what did that mean for him, a human in a world of beasts? One evening, Lyra visited again, this time with two other figures at her side. Beast folk women, both with feline features, their sharp eyes gleaming as they looked at Elias. Their presence was even more intimidating than the guards, and Elias felt their eyes on him like a weight. Lyra walked past them, her gaze never leaving his, and seated herself on one of the cushions near the bed. You've been here long enough to see how things work, Lyra said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it. But you still don't understand, do you? Elias stood from the bed, the movement automatic, as if the presence of Lyra and her companions demanded a certain level of respect. He didn't know how to respond. He felt as if he were caught in a strange game where the rules kept shifting, but he didn't know the language. He looked at Lyra, his heart racing in his chest. I don't understand any of this, he admitted. Why am I here? What do you want from me? Lyra smiled softly, a quiet, knowing expression. She leaned back, her eyes glinting in the soft light. I told you, you're here because you're different, and here difference has value. The two women who accompanied her remained silent, standing like sentinels, their eyes scanning Elias as if assessing him like prey. He felt exposed under their gaze, their predatory energy palpable. One of the women, a tall figure with sleek black fur and piercing green eyes, stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Her gaze was locked on Elias, and the air between them thickened. Lyra seemed to notice his discomfort and raised a hand, signaling for the woman to stop. She gave a soft chuckle. Relax, Elias. They're just curious. The tension in the room didn't ease, though. In fact, it seemed to grow more oppressive as Lyra stood, her body language confident, commanding. She moved toward Elias, stopping just a few feet from him. The scent of wildflowers and something earthy filled the air, her presence powerful and overwhelming. There's power in difference, Lyra continued, her voice low, almost a whisper. And in this world, power is everything. You'll have to learn to navigate that power if you want to survive. Elias's chest tightened at her words. He didn't want to think about survival, about what was required to stay alive in this strange and dangerous world. But he knew deep down that it was inevitable. He wasn't going to be sent home. He was trapped here, and no matter how much he resisted, the only way forward was through the rules of this place. But how did one learn to navigate power like this? Lyra's eyes softened just slightly, but the edge in her voice remained. You have a choice, Elias. You can become part of this world, or you can remain an outsider. But if you choose to stay an outsider, there's a price to be paid. Elias swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of price she meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. The woman with the green eyes stepped closer again, her gaze never wavering from his. She tilted her head, as if sizing him up, then looked at Lyra for a brief moment before speaking. You were right, Lyra. He's weak. Lyra didn't flinch at the words, her gaze unwavering. Yes, but there's more to him, more than meets the eye. Elias's mind was racing, his thoughts scattered. He felt the pressure building in the room, like a storm gathering strength, and he wasn't sure if he could weather it. There was something dangerous in the way they spoke to him, the way their eyes lingered on him. He wanted to break free from it, to run, but he couldn't. He had no idea where he would go. He was a human in a world of beasts, and this was the reality he had to face. Lyra stepped back then, and the atmosphere seemed to shift. It wasn't that the tension had dissipated. It had only become more subtle, more layered. There was still an undeniable weight to the air, but now it felt as if she had placed him on a scale, balancing him between what he was and what they wanted him to be. You'll learn, Lyra said, her voice softer this time, but still commanding. And in time, you'll understand why you're here, and what it means to be part of this world. Elias opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. There was too much to ask, too much to understand. But he had learned enough to know that there was no easy answer. One of the feline women, her fur darker, her eyes more golden than green, approached Elias with a fluidity that made his breath catch in his throat. Her movements were precise, like a predator closing in on its prey, but there was no hostility in her eyes. Instead, there was something else. Curiosity. It was strange, unsettling, yet fascinating all the same. The woman reached out, her fingers grazing his shoulder lightly, almost experimentally. The touch was brief, but Elias felt it linger, a spark of something electric running through him at the contact. His skin tingled where she had touched him, and for the briefest moment, he could almost feel her presence wrapping around him like an invisible force. Lyra observed all of this with quiet interest, her gaze flicking from the woman's hand to Elias's face. She didn't speak, but the air between them seemed to pulse with some unspoken challenge. Elias wasn't sure what was expected of him, but he could feel the weight of their gaze, the expectation that he would either react or submit. Let him be for now, Lyra finally said, breaking the moment of tension. We'll see how he handles the next test. The woman stepped back, and Elias was left with his heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea what the next test would be, but he knew that each interaction, each moment here, was a step into something deeper, a path he had no choice but to walk. As Lyra turned to leave, her voice lingered in the air. Remember, Elias, she said, her tone still soft but firm. This world is governed by strength. Whether you like it or not, you'll have to fight for your place in it. Elias stood in the center of the room, the words echoing in his mind. He wasn't sure how much more he could endure, but one thing was certain. If he was going to survive here, he would need to understand the game they were playing. And that meant learning how to wield strength in a world where he was the weakest player. The door closed behind Lyra, leaving him alone once more, his mind whirling with the weight of the challenge ahead. The following morning, Elias found himself in the midst of a new routine, one that felt both unnerving and strangely necessary. After the tense conversation with Lyra and the other women the night before, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He'd been given little explanation of what the next test would be, but the weight of their words had left him with a sense of impending challenge. He was escorted from his chamber by the guards to a larger room, one that had clearly been designed for training. The walls were lined with racks of weapons, swords, spears, and other strange implements he didn't recognize. The floor was made of smooth stone, and the space felt open, as if meant for someone to move freely. And yet, Elias couldn't help but feel confined by the unfamiliarity of it all. The starkness of the room, the quiet hum of anticipation in the air, it all spoke of a purpose he wasn't privy to yet. When the guards left him there, Elias was alone for a moment, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't trained for battle. He wasn't prepared for any of this. Yet the beasts around him clearly expected something from him, and Lyra's words replayed in his mind, pushing him into action. Strength is everything here. A door opened on the far side of the room, and Elias's eyes immediately shot to it, his heart racing as Lyra entered, her stride confident, her posture regal. Her presence was as imposing as ever, but there was something in her expression today that felt different, something less calculating, more focused. "You're ready for your next test," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an undeniable authority. Elias swallowed, unsure what she meant. Test? What kind of test? Lyra smiled, but there was no warmth in it. A test of your instincts, of your ability to adapt. She gestured to the center of the room. Come. Hesitantly, Elias walked toward her, his boots making faint echoes against the stone floor. He couldn't help but feel like he was stepping into a different world every time he moved through this place, as if the rules kept changing and he was still trying to catch up. "Your task is simple," Lyra continued, her gaze meeting his. "You will face a challenge. How you handle it will determine your place here." Before he could respond, the door opened once more, this time revealing a large beast-folk figure, a towering male with fur as dark as the night sky, his muscles rippling with every movement. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He was even more massive than any of the guards, his eyes glowing with an intensity that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. Lyra nodded to the beast, and without warning, the male lunged forward, his speed startling. Elias instinctively stepped back, his heart pounding. The creature's powerful presence filled the space between them, and for a moment, Elias was paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of danger. But the creature didn't strike. Instead, he circled Elias, his eyes never leaving him. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and Elias could feel every muscle in his body tense as well. This wasn't a fight for survival, at least not yet. But the weight of the moment was not lost on him. Lyra's voice cut through the silence. "The test is not one of strength. It is of control." She looked at Elias, her gaze penetrating. "Your opponent will try to provoke you. He will test your reactions. Do not let your fear dictate your actions." Elias nodded, his body rigid. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there. The creature in front of him was testing him, probing him, and Elias knew that whatever he did now would shape how the rest of his time here unfolded. The large beast lunged again, quicker than before, his claws extending toward Elias. He barely had time to react, but instinct took over. He sidestepped, barely avoiding the sharp claws that slashed through the air where he had stood only a moment before. The movement felt clumsy, he wasn't trained for this, but the adrenaline made it easier to keep his focus. The creature growled in amusement and stepped back, circling Elias again. Lyra observed silently, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. Elias's chest rose and fell with each breath, the tension in his body still vibrating from the near miss. He knew he couldn't keep dodging forever. The creature wasn't playing around, and if he made even one wrong move, he could end up on the floor, incapacitated. Focus. Lyra's voice rang out again, like a command. Trust your instincts. You are not just here to survive. You are here to prove your worth. The beast made another attempt, this time coming in low, trying to tackle Elias to the ground. But Elias was ready. He sidestepped once more, this time grabbing hold of a nearby training staff, a wooden spear-like weapon. It wasn't much, but it was something. He jabbed it forward, aiming for the beast's chest. The creature deflected the blow easily, but it was enough to create space between them. Elias could feel his hands shaking as he held the staff. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up, but something inside him pushed him forward. The creature's eyes narrowed, a hint of respect in his gaze as he stepped back, growling low. It was a sound of frustration, but Elias didn't let his guard down. The test wasn't over. Not yet. Lyra's voice cut through the tension, her words colder this time. You are not proving anything by playing it safe. You cannot hesitate. You need to dominate. Elias flinched at the command, but it drove something inside him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or anger that pushed him forward, but he charged at the beast, swinging the staff with all the force he could muster. The creature's eyes widened in surprise as he blocked the blow, the force behind it making him stumble slightly. For a brief moment, Elias saw an opening, an opportunity. With a quick movement, he used his body's momentum to bring the staff down toward the creature's side. It landed with a satisfying crack, and the beast let out a sharp grunt of pain. The creature stepped back, clearly momentarily stunned by the hit. Elias's heart raced in his chest, his body on edge, but he wasn't done. He needed to press his advantage. But before he could react further, Lyra's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Enough! The room fell silent in an instant. Elias's chest heaved as he caught his breath, the adrenaline still coursing through him. The creature, too, had stopped, watching him carefully. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes appraising Elias. You are not yet ready, she said, her tone hard, but there was a flicker of something, maybe approval, in her gaze. But you are learning. Elias stood still catching his breath. He had failed, yet somehow the situation didn't feel as crushing as he had expected. He had survived. That was something. And as Lyra turned to leave, she glanced over her shoulder and spoke one final time. This is just the beginning, Elias, she said, her voice cool but laced with something else. The tests will only get harder. Elias nodded, his mind already racing with thoughts of what would come next. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. If he was going to survive, he would have to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. Elias stood motionless in the center of the training room, his breath still heavy from the confrontation with the beast folk. He had survived. That was the only thing he could hold on to, his survival. But the words Lyra had spoken earlier echoed in his mind. You are not yet ready. The sting of failure was there, but it was wrapped in the faintest thread of relief. He hadn't been knocked out or incapacitated. That, at least, was progress. His body still tingled from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The faint ache in his muscles was a reminder of the fight, but Elias couldn't help but feel something else too. He had struck back. He had defended himself. And though it wasn't enough to satisfy Lyra's expectations, it was something. The doors to the training hall creaked open, and Elias looked up. Lyra strode into the room, her steps measured and graceful. Her gaze locked onto him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she were weighing every part of him in that single glance. "Well," she said, breaking the silence, "you've done better than expected." Elias didn't know whether to take the words as praise or as mere commentary. He wasn't sure what she expected, but it was clear that she had no intentions of offering comfort. "You're still far from ready," Lyra continued, her voice calm but firm. "But you've shown the potential to survive. That's a start." The words stung, but Elias nodded, keeping his face impassive. He had to keep moving forward. He couldn't let this place break him down, not when he knew that each step could bring him closer to an answer, to a way out, or perhaps to understanding the strange place he'd been thrust into. Lyra studied him for a long moment before turning toward the door, her back now to him. "Follow me," she commanded. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second. Where were they going now? He had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. But without another word, he obeyed, his footsteps falling into sync with hers as they left the training room. The halls of the fortress were as imposing as ever, with their cold stone walls and echoing silence. But Elias's mind was elsewhere. Not ready, she had said. Was he ever going to be ready? The thought hung heavily in his mind as he followed Lyra deeper into the fortress. After a few turns and a short walk, they arrived at a large, ornate door. It was unlike any other door Elias had seen in the fortress, tall, with intricate carvings and a soft, golden glow emanating from the cracks around its edges. There was something different about this place, a kind of energy that felt almost ancient, as though it had been untouched for centuries. Lyra opened the door with ease, stepping inside without hesitation. Elias followed her, his curiosity piqued, but as he entered the room, he was struck by the overwhelming sense of awe. It was a vast chamber, filled with tall columns and warm, glowing light. At the far end of the room, there was a large stone dais, upon which sat a throne made of what looked like shimmering obsidian, its surface catching the light in strange, hypnotic patterns. Sitting on the throne was a figure Elias had not yet encountered, an imposing, regal woman with an aura that demanded attention. She was dressed in flowing robes made from some kind of dark, iridescent fabric that shimmered like the night sky, her long hair cascading in silvery waves down her back. Her eyes, a deep shade of gold, fixed on Elias as soon as he entered the room, and he felt an intense pull, as though her gaze could see through him. "This is the queen," Lyra said, her voice reverent. "She is the ruler of this land and the one who will decide your fate." Elias couldn't help but stare. There was something captivating about the woman on the throne, something more than her beauty, more than her power. There was an undeniable magnetism to her presence, a strength that filled the room and made everything else feel insignificant. The queen regarded him silently for a long moment, her gaze never wavering. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and commanding. "Human," she began, "you've survived your first test, but it is only the beginning. You must understand that here, in our world, survival means far more than simply living. It means knowing when to strike, when to submit, and when to show your true strength." Elias swallowed, unsure how to respond. This woman, this queen, was like nothing he had ever encountered before. There was an underlying warmth to her voice, but beneath it was something else, something darker and more powerful. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he had no idea where he stood in relation to her. "What do you want from me?" Elias finally asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty coursing through him. The queen smiled, though there was little warmth in it. "What I want," she said slowly, "is for you to prove yourself. You may have survived the first test, but now you must show me your true worth. If you can withstand the trials ahead, you may earn your place here." Elias wasn't sure what she meant by true worth. Was this another test? Another challenge to prove himself? He met her gaze, trying not to show how uncertain he felt. "And what if I don't survive?" The queen's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Then you will have your answer." There was no comfort in her words, but Elias was too far into this now to turn back. He had already proven he could survive. Whatever came next, he would have to face it head on. Now, the queen said, her voice sharp, you will meet with the others. The next trial begins soon. Elias felt a flicker of nervousness within him as Lyra stepped forward, motioning for him to follow. He was far from ready for what was ahead, but something inside him had shifted. The weight of the trials before him wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about learning what he was capable of, about understanding this world he had been thrust into. He followed Lyra from the throne room, his mind racing. The next test, whatever it was, would come soon. And this time, he wasn't sure if mere survival would be enough. The days that followed felt like a blur of tension and preparation. Elias had learned little more than how to survive each new challenge the beastfolk set before him. The tests were never straightforward, some physical, others psychological, but they all pushed him to the edge. Each day, he found himself on the brink of exhaustion, but it was the moments in between that began to weigh on him more. Lyra's words haunted him. The trials will get harder. What more could they throw at him? What was the true test? He had been trying his best to keep up, to learn, to adapt, but every time he thought he had a moment to breathe, the next test was already waiting for him. Today was no different. He stood in a large, open courtyard, his back straight and his hands clenched at his sides. Lyra stood before him, her expression unreadable as usual, her eyes sharp as she assessed him. Behind her, the distant sounds of the beastfolk going about their day were muffled by the oppressive silence that seemed to envelop them whenever she was near. You've proven you can endure the physical tests, Lyra began, her voice cool, measured. But now you must prove something else. Elias furrowed his brow, unsure of what she meant. Hadn't he already shown enough? The bruises from the previous tests still ached. His body sore in places he hadn't known could hurt. He had survived each trial, but the deeper questions remained unanswered. Lyra stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. You will face your greatest challenge yet. It is not about strength nor speed. It is about understanding. Elias's pulse quickened at the intensity of her words. What was she asking of him? He opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by Lyra raising a hand. Do not speak, she said, her voice low but commanding. You will understand soon enough. With a swift motion, she turned and began to walk toward the center of the courtyard. Elias followed hesitantly, the uncertainty in his chest growing with every step. He could feel the weight of her presence behind him, a constant reminder that nothing in this world was predictable. The stakes felt higher now, and as they reached the center of the courtyard, Elias saw what she had meant by understanding. A tall, slender figure stood in the middle of the space, draped in flowing robes that glittered under the sun. Her long white hair framed her face, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. She was different from the others Elias had encountered. Her presence was regal, and though she had the same beast-folk features, there was an undeniable elegance to her movements. This is Alira, Lyra said, introducing the woman without fanfare. She is a counselor and a figure of authority. She will be your partner for this trial. Elias felt his brow furrow in confusion. Partner? What kind of test was this? He turned his gaze from Lyra to Alira, who regarded him with an inscrutable expression. There was a softness to her features, but there was also something commanding about her stance. She wasn't like the other beastfolk who had tested him with brute force. There was a different energy about her. You will not fight her, Lyra said, as though reading his thoughts. This is a test of communication, a test of connection. Elias blinked, not fully understanding. Communication. How could that be a test? Your task is to learn about Alira. She will ask you questions. Your answers will determine your fate here. Be honest, but also be mindful. Lyra's tone was sharp, every word calculated. You are not just representing yourself. You are representing humanity. Do not forget that. A chill ran down Elias's spine. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for his people, for humanity. The weight of Lyra's words settled heavily in his chest. He had been so focused on surviving that he hadn't allowed himself to consider the larger consequences. Alira stepped forward, her eyes locking with his, and a strange shiver went through him. Her gaze was penetrating, and for a moment, it felt as though she could see through him, as though she understood things about him that he didn't even know himself. She tilted her head, studying him silently for a moment before speaking. "You are not like the others," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made Elias feel both vulnerable and exposed. "Why is that?" Elias hesitated, the question striking him more deeply than he had expected. Why was he different? Was it his humanity, his curiosity, his willingness to survive, even when every part of him screamed to run? "I don't know," he replied honestly, his voice sounding smaller than he intended. "I was thrown into this. I didn't have a choice." Alira nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "We all make choices, even when we believe we don't have any," she said, her words carrying a subtle weight. "But tell me, human, when faced with the unknown, what drives you to keep moving forward?" Elias exhaled slowly, his thoughts swirling as he tried to find an answer that would satisfy her. The question was deceptively simple, but the answer felt like it would reveal more about him than he was ready to admit. "I guess," he started, pausing as he searched for the right words. "I guess it's because I don't know what will happen next, and I want to find out. I have to find out." Alira seemed to consider his words for a long moment, her eyes flickering with something Elias couldn't quite place. She stepped closer, her presence suddenly more overwhelming. Despite the distance between them, it felt as though she were closing in, her energy shifting, swirling around him like a cloud he couldn't escape. "There is power in the unknown," Alira said softly. "The desire to explore it can be both a gift and a curse. You have yet to see the true consequences of that drive. It can consume you, or it can shape you into something greater." Elias felt his throat tighten. What was she implying? What kind of trial was this really? Lyra's voice cut through the tension. "Enough," she said firmly. "This test is not about your words. It is about your understanding of the world around you." Alira stepped back, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "For now, we are finished." Elias blinked in confusion. Finished? It had barely begun. He had expected something more concrete, but instead, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something far more complex than he had anticipated. Lyra motioned for him to follow as she turned toward the door. "You'll have time to reflect. The next phase of your trial will begin soon. Be ready, Elias. The hardest tests are yet to come." As he walked away, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The encounter with Alira had left him unsettled, unsure of what to think or how to prepare. The trials were no longer just about survival. They were about something deeper, something far more dangerous, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The days following his conversation with Alira passed in a haze of uncertainty. Elias had spent hours reflecting on her words, her piercing gaze, and the quiet power she radiated. There was something about her presence that unsettled him, but it wasn't just that. It was the way she had made him question everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in this strange world. The trials had become more complex, each test leaving him more exhausted than the last. Physical endurance had never been his strong suit, but the mental and emotional toll was what truly began to wear on him. Every time he thought he understood the purpose of the trials, they twisted into something new. It wasn't just survival. It wasn't just proving his strength. It was about something deeper, something far more intangible. As he walked the halls of the fortress, his muscles aching and his mind spinning, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. A final test, perhaps. A challenge that would push him to the very edge. Lyra appeared before him, her eyes sharp and calculating. As always, she seemed to materialize from the shadows of the hall, her presence commanding and steady. Elias stopped in his tracks as she approached. "It's time," Lyra said, her voice cold and direct. "The final phase of your trials begins now. Come with me." Elias followed her without question, his stomach twisting in anticipation. He had come so far, but each step only seemed to lead to more uncertainty. What was this final trial? Was it going to be a fight, a test of strength, or something else entirely? They made their way through the fortress, the halls growing darker as they descended deeper. Elias's heart began to race as the air grew thicker, heavier with the weight of what lay ahead. Lyra moved with a purposeful stride, never faltering as she led him to a large, iron door at the end of a long corridor. The door was imposing, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. There was no mistaking it. This was a place where important decisions were made. "Enter," Lyra instructed, her voice still unreadable. Elias hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the door, stepping into the chamber beyond. His breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. The room was vast, with high stone walls that stretched far above him. At the center of the room was a large, circular platform, and standing on it, waiting for him, was the queen. She was bathed in a soft, ethereal light, her presence even more imposing than it had been before. Elias could feel the weight of her gaze as she studied him, her golden eyes never leaving him for a second. The air seemed to hum with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. "You've come far," the queen's voice echoed through the chamber, low and steady. "But this is where it ends. The true test has begun." Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. What did she mean? Was this the final challenge? He was no longer sure of anything. "Come forward," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Elias stepped onto the platform, his feet heavy as he moved toward her. Each step felt like it took him closer to something inevitable, something he wasn't sure he was prepared for. The queen stood tall, her eyes watching him with a mixture of expectation and something darker, something he couldn't quite place. "You have proven yourself in ways that few could," she said, her voice tinged with something like admiration. "But now you must prove your understanding, not of strength, not of endurance, but of your place in this world." Her words struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. His place in this world? Was that what this had all been about? Understanding his role, his purpose? The queen stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. Elias felt a tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if something was building between them. Her gaze softened slightly, though there was still an intensity to it that made his heart race. "You've spent all this time fighting, surviving, learning. But have you considered the price of all this?" The queen's voice dropped to a whisper, though it still carried throughout the chamber. "Have you truly considered what it means to be human? To stand here in a world not your own?" Elias swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her question. He had been so focused on surviving, on proving himself, that he hadn't thought about the consequences of his actions. He hadn't thought about how his very existence here might affect those around him, or what it meant to be the only human in a world of beastfolk. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, the queen continued. "Here, in this place, power is everything," she said, her voice now a smooth, rhythmic cadence. "It is the foundation of our society, and you, human, are an anomaly, a creature born of weakness in a world of strength. How will you survive here, knowing that you are not like us, that you do not belong?" Elias's chest tightened. The queen's words stung, but they were laced with a truth he couldn't ignore. He didn't belong, he was different, out of place, and the longer he stayed here, the more he wondered if he ever would. "You've been tested in many ways," the queen continued, her voice softer now, though still commanding. "But now you must prove your worth in the most important way. You must show that you understand the very nature of this world. You must prove that you can fit into it, or risk losing everything." Elias's mind raced. Asterisk, lose everything? What did that mean? Asterisk. He opened his mouth again, his throat dry, but before he could speak, the queen held up a hand, silencing him. "This is not something you can answer with words," she said, her voice like silk. "This is something you must feel. You must understand what it means to be here, to be part of this world, in a way that transcends mere survival." Elias was lost. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the pressure of the queen's presence suffocating. He was unsure what was happening, unsure of what she wanted from him. "Prove it," she commanded, her tone suddenly sharp. Prove that you understand your place in this world. For a long moment, Elias stood frozen, the weight of the queen's words pressing against him. What was she asking of him? He didn't know, but something inside him stirred. He had come so far, had endured so much. Maybe it was time to stop running from the questions and face them head on. The queen watched him silently, as if waiting for him to make his move. And for the first time, Elias knew that whatever happened next, it would change everything. Elias stood before the queen, the weight of her command pressing down on him like an immovable force. Her gaze never wavered. Her golden eyes locked onto his with an intensity that seemed to pierce through him. Every muscle in his body tensed, his mind racing, but still, he couldn't bring himself to move. The room around him felt too large, too imposing, as if the walls were closing in, the air thick with the tension of unspoken expectations. "What do you want from me?" he finally managed to ask, his voice rough, strained. The queen did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint echo of Elias's breath. Then, slowly, she took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Her presence was overwhelming, and Elias instinctively took a step back, though it seemed futile. "You are afraid," she said softly, her voice low and almost soothing. "Afraid of what it means to truly understand your place here, in a world that is not your own. You fear the power we hold, the control we possess." Elias's throat tightened. He couldn't deny the truth of her words. It was true. Everything about this place terrified him. The strength of the beast folk, the sheer raw power that emanated from every creature around him. It was nothing like the world he had come from. Here he was small, fragile, and yet the queen was offering him a chance to prove himself. But how? How could he prove himself in a world so different, so far beyond anything he had ever known? "I'm not afraid," he said, though even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. "I just don't know what you want from me." The queen's lips curled into a faint smile, and she took another step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "What I want from you, human, is simple. I want you to understand what it means to belong here, to accept who you are, not as a mere outsider, but as part of this world, part of us." Elias's heart skipped a beat. The queen's words settled over him like a heavy cloak, suffocating and yet strangely comforting. Part of us? Was that what she was asking? Was she offering him a place among them, among the beast folk, a place that he could never have imagined for himself? She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but deliberate. The warmth of her skin sent a jolt through him, and for a brief moment, Elias felt his defenses crack. There was something in her touch, something in the way she looked at him, that made him feel as though he were being seen, truly seen, for the first time. "Do you understand?" the queen whispered, her voice like silk, sliding into his mind and soul. "Do you understand what it means to belong here? To feel connected to something greater than yourself?" Elias's breath hitched, the air thick around him. He swallowed hard, struggling to gather his thoughts. Part of him wanted to pull away, to escape the overwhelming intensity of her presence, but another part, something deeper, something primal, urged him to stay, to let go of his fear and embrace whatever it was that she was offering. The queen's hand slid up his arm, slowly, deliberately, until it rested on his shoulder. Her eyes were steady, unwavering, and as she looked at him, Elias felt a strange pull in his chest. There was a warmth in her gaze, an intensity that made his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. "I've seen you struggle," she murmured. "I've seen you fight, strive, and suffer. But now, Elias, it's time to surrender. Surrender to the truth that lies within you." Elias closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. Surrender. It was a word he hadn't wanted to hear. He had fought for everything in his life, fought to survive, to make a place for himself in a world that was not his own. But now, standing before the queen, feeling the heat of her touch, he wondered if the fight had been futile all along. Could he surrender? Could he accept that maybe, just maybe, this was where he was meant to be? I don't know if I can, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know how. The queen's smile deepened, and she moved closer still, her body brushing against his in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. Her scent, earthy, wild, and intoxicating, filled his senses, clouding his thoughts. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear, her breath hot against his skin. You don't have to know, she whispered. You don't have to understand it all right now. All you need to do is trust. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as the queen's words lingered in his mind. Trust. It was the one thing he had never fully given, the one thing he had kept locked away deep inside. But now, in this moment, with the queen so close, he felt that trust beginning to slip past his defenses, a slow, steady trickle that threatened to break through. She pulled away just enough to meet his gaze, her eyes filled with something unreadable, something wild and untamed. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat as she looked at him, her expression softening, almost tender. Let go, Elias, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. Let go, and accept what is being offered. Her hand moved from his shoulder, sliding slowly down his arm to rest on his chest, just above his heart. The touch was light, delicate, and yet it sent a wave of heat through him, a feeling that twisted deep inside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elias's mind raced, his heart pounding as he struggled to reconcile the feelings swirling inside him. Could he truly let go? Could he surrender to the world that the queen had shown him, to the strange and alluring power that called to him from within? Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elias nodded. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know what the future held. But in that moment, as the queen's touch lingered on his chest, he knew one thing for certain. He had made his choice, and whatever came next, he would face it with her.